Hello, my name is Anne Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow armchair historians. Some of you may have heard me talk about my home in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. However, prior to moving here in 2013, I lived in Newtown, Connecticut for almost 2 decades. Of all the places I've lived, Newtown was the first to feel like home. I remember driving through the classic pastoral New England landscape dotted with colonial salt box houses for the first time. I felt an immediate connection in my cells. It was a weird, almost longing. Several years later, the town that hosted Rochambeau and his troops as they marched across Connecticut between Virginia and Providence, Rhode Island in 1781 and 1782 did in fact become my home. Flash forward to May 2001, when I was hired as a supervisor for an internationally recognized coffee company to work in their Newtown store. It was there that my connection to the town and its people was solidified. Over the next 11 years, I would build relationships with regulars that included school teachers, parents of elementary school children who would come to the coffee shop to wait for their kids to finish their first communion classes at the Catholic church next door. Father Bob from that Catholic church, several celebrities, local law enforcement, and first responders, etc. On December 14, 2012, at around 10 a.m., as I was registering for my final semester of grad school, I overheard a woman behind the registrar desk saying there had been a shooting in Newtown. I couldn't get out of there fast enough, but was frustrated to find that none of the local radio stations available in my car were carrying the story yet. So I called my then boyfriend and asked him to get on the computer and do a search, which he did, and read a couple of breaking news stories about the horrifying chain of events that had just played out at Sandy Hook Elementary School, a school just half a mile from the coffee shop that I worked at. It would come out that the son of one of my regular and favorite customers had shot his way through a glass panel next to the locked front entrance doors at Sandy Hook Elementary School, armed with his mother's Bushmaster XM-15 E2S rifle and 10 magazines with 30 rounds each, after shooting his mother with a .22 caliber Savage Mark II rifle. Apparently, guns were the only way my customer and her son were able to bond. The shooter had a familiarity and access to his mother's firearms and ammunition. He also had an obsession with mass murders, in particular the April 1999 shooting at Columbine High School in Colorado. I felt a sense of urgency to get to work, even though I wasn't scheduled for another few hours. In a very visceral way, I needed to be there for my community and my staff. Over the course of the next few hours, I would come to serve parents of school-aged children who gathered at the coffee shop until they could be reunited with their children, because all of the local schools were in lockdown. Some of those parents would not be reunited with their children. Lauren Rousseau, who also worked for the same coffee company as me, would valiantly lose her life that day During the shooting, Rousseau herded her first grade students into the restroom to hide from the shooter. The shooter found them and opened fire, killing Rousseau and 15 of her students. Only one of them survived. My daughter went to elementary school in Stratford, Connecticut with Vicky Soto, who also valiantly lost her life trying to protect her students that day. Over the coming days and weeks, my staff and I would absorb the shock of a community that would never be the same again. Perhaps the worst memories for me are of the funeral rushes, that is, the out-the-door lines of customers attending the back-to-back funerals of grade schoolers conducted by Father Bob at St. Rose of Lima, the Catholic church next door. As you listen to this episode of Armchair Historians, I'd like you to think about what you are doing to bring about change for the future. Mike talks about incremental change, which seems more attainable than a complete overhaul right now. I too will think about how I can take action in order to honor the precious lives taken on 12/14/12, and how I can be part of the discussion, and how I can educate myself to use my vote for policymakers that are working to end gun violence in our country. Mike Lawlor, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Glad to be here. This is great.
Yeah, I'm excited. So we're just going to do what I always do and start at the beginning and talk about what's your favorite history that we're going to be talking about. And I almost didn't want to ask that question because favorite is probably not a really good description of, what we're going to be talking about. But let's just start there and see what happens.
I guess I have a lot of different types of favorite history. I've had a lot of different experiences in my life, but on point today, right? Since the topic of the shootings in Sandy Hook comes up, and we're at the anniversary of it actually right now, it's indelible, right? The memory of these events is indelible, and I think everyone who experienced it will never forget how they felt and where they were when they got the news, that type of thing. Interestingly, at the same time, we have a young son who at the time was about that age, and it's just such a scary thought. And we're actually seeing it playing out again now in real time in Michigan. These are events that change people's lives, and it certainly had a big impact on mine.
Just a little self-disclosure. We were talking before we started recording. I lived in Newtown for 20-some years. I live in Colorado now, but I was living in Newtown, and I was working at it's a famous national chain of coffee houses in Sandy Hook, just a half a mile from the school for 11 years. And so this topic is really personal for me, and I'm probably going to get emotional because I really haven't talked about this in a long time, but I think it's time to start looking at where we are. COVID was actually a nice year off from school shootings, and here we are back again. So I wanted to do an episode about Sandy Hook that is not just, talking about how terrible it was and how horrible we feel, but I want to be proactive and talk about some of the things that you've done, where you're coming from, and where you see us going as far as gun legislation goes. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your history with that.
So I grew up in East Haven, Connecticut, and I'm a lawyer, so I was a prosecutor. It was my first job out of law school, and then I ran for the Connecticut legislature when I was 29 years old and got elected. And I served there for 24 years, and most of that time I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, where we have jurisdiction over everything from criminal laws down to bankruptcy laws and things like that. And so I've always believed that there are common sense gun control laws that respect people's Second Amendment rights, but at the same time accomplish what I think should be the main public policy goal in our country. And so I think the easiest way to explain that is to say that at the moment, back then too, but even more so now, there are way more guns in circulation in this country than there are responsible gun owners. And I think the goal of public policy should be to narrow that gap. And so, how you do that is obviously complicated and very controversial. Connecticut, um, you know, along with some of the other northeastern states, has really been an innovator when it comes to effective ways to enact responsible gun control legislation. So, for example, it's always been the case in our state that if you want to carry around a handgun, you had to have a permit. In order to get that permit, you had to do a face-to-face meeting with your local police. You need to pass a background check. You need to go through some mandatory training. Um, then in the early 1990s, around the country, it seemed as though the gun manufacturers, who, by the way, have their lobbying group is based in Newtown, Connecticut,
Yeah.
um, the ironically, that it's clear a decision was made to try and manufacture and aggressively market what they started to call modern sporting weapons, sporting rifles. And those are what most of us refer to as assault weapons. They're based on a military weapon. They're modified so they're not fully automatic, so they're not machine guns. It's not like you can pull the trigger and it just keeps on firing. But um, these started to appear in the marketplace in the early 1990s, and relatively soon after that, they were being used in what we now call mass shootings, right, including school shootings. So in 1993, Connecticut was one of the first states to ban assault weapons. And in 1994, the United States Congress banned the manufacture and sale of new assault weapons, but they sort of grandfathered in the ones that were already in circulation, as did Connecticut. And so, starting in 1994, there was a federal ban on the manufacture and sale of these types of weapons to civilians. But as a compromise, when that law got passed in Congress, there was a sunset placed on it, meaning it would expire in 10 years unless it was renewed. And in 2004, there was a new president, a new Congress, and needless to say, they did not renew the federal assault weapon ban. And ever since that time, ever since 2004, I think it's fair to say the gun manufacturers have really been extremely aggressive in marketing these weapons around the country. And at the moment, they're widely available. They're banned in some states, but in a lot of states, they are not. In 2000, it turned out that the Connecticut ban, which did not grandfather in all the guns manufactured before 2004, it turned out that the manufacturers are trying to get around that ban, or gun owners are trying to get around the ban by slightly modifying the weapons that were available so they didn't fall under the definition of what counted as an assault weapon. So Connecticut changed, expanded our definition for the state ban in 2000. And the reason I'm telling you this sequence of events is when the federal ban expires in 2004, and when the gun manufacturers start to manufacture their new weapons, they were clearly doing it in a way that it would get around some of the existing bans in states like Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts, where the ownership of these weapons was just banned altogether, and there was no sunset. So fast forward to 2012, the shooter in Sandy Hook, his mother apparently thought it would be a good idea to buy one of these modern sporting rifles for her son. According to the investigation that ensued, she felt that guns and shooting guns was the only way that he kind of seemed to get some satisfaction out of life. I mean, this kid was a shut-in. He was probably on the spectrum, and was living in the home. We later found out in his bedroom all the windows were blocked up, and he was obsessed with guns and mass shootings and things like that. But so the weapon she was able to buy is this Bushmaster rifle, which if you looked at it, you'd say, well, that's an assault weapon, but it wasn't technically covered by the definition that Connecticut had in place at the time. So mom was legally able to buy the weapon in a gun store here in Connecticut, and that's the weapon that this guy used to kill all those school children and their
Mm,
teachers that day.
yeah.
And so after that, Connecticut enacted a very comprehensive set of gun laws, which I'm happy to go into in a minute. But I just want to say, like, you see this throughout the evolution of gun control legislation. It's like laws get passed which are aimed at trying to shrink this gap between the number of guns in circulation and the number of responsible gun owners and the types of guns that are available. And each and every time, the gun manufacturers try and get around. They try and find the loopholes in these
Hmm.
laws to make available these types of extremely deadly weapons, which are clearly designed just in the case of these assault weapons. I mean, the whole point is to design a rifle that can kill as many people as possible, as quickly as
Hmm.
possible, and as accurately as possible. I mean, that's why those guns were designed for the military. And so um, there's many other laws that were enacted here in Connecticut, but the point is, like, each and every time, the gun manufacturers and the gun advocates, the so-called Second Amendment people, seem to be viewing it as a sport to
Hmm.
try and avoid these laws, and as a result, more and more laws are enacted, et cetera. So it's a little bit frustrating, but that's a short version of just the assault weapon story.
Yeah. So, just some more information about me. I started working at the coffee chain that I referenced earlier in 2001, and I met this woman who was a customer. And at that point in my life, I was really trying to be a different person. I'm just going to say that. And so, this woman comes in, and she was a really difficult customer. And I thought to myself, Anne Marie, you need to do something different instead of just have a crappy attitude. Anyways, long story short, I won that customer over. And that customer was Nancy, was Adam's mother. And I had an ongoing relationship with her for 11 years at the counter because she would come in and talk to me. And so when I looked, flash forward to 2012, and I do remember her coming in with him, and she would be standing at the counter, and he would be at the door, very antsy, and she would always be really nervous. And so it was. I didn't know. I didn't know that she had an arsenal in her house. I didn't know that that's how she bonded with him until the news started coming out, and I saw her picture in the paper on the Saturday after the shooting. And my question, and the reason I'm talking about this is I wonder. I know you authored the red flag law, which is a model for states since then. That was in 1999. And I wonder if that law, if you have somebody in the house like that who has mental health issues, would that law be in effect?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could tell you the whole story about the red flag laws. That's actually a separate but very interesting story. But to answer your question, had someone called the police and reported that they were concerned that this young man had apparently access to a bunch of firearms and was in the kinds of behavior he was involved with. There was misconduct at school. There was the homeschooling, what his home life was like, what his mother was, decided to buy him one of these weapons. Apparently she would go out for cocktails or something with some of the other ladies in Newtown. And apparently she would share some of her stories about how her son, this was his only source of joy or
Mm-hmm.
satisfaction or whatever. I think if any of those, not, I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
like, to answer your question, had they said, something sounds wrong here, maybe we should just alert the police. And had the police followed the process for the red flag law, I bet you they would have been able to separate him from those weapons
Mm.
and refer him to some
Mm.
type of mental health evaluation. So I
Mm-hmm.
mean that's what the law is designed to do,
Okay.
right? And it's very frustrating. And Governor Malloy, who I was working for at the time, as his criminal justice guy, he started the mantra, that we started hearing, I guess, after the September 11th terrorist attacks. But in this respect, if you see something,
Say
say
something.
something, right? And
Yeah.
we saw this play out just the other day in Michigan, right? I mean, people were generally aware of a situation, and I think people are wondering, what can I do? Should I say something? Am I interfering? What about gun rights and all these things? Like, well, look, you've got to say something, and then hopefully the police will follow up. I mean, that's not always the case, but the law provides an option for them to use. So, but I think this tragedy could have been prevented for sure.
Mm, mm, yeah, interesting. Well, that's good to know. And I think that's it. I've been hearing that all week for some reason. See something, say something.
Yep.
So do that, people out there that are listening. And
And not to interrupt, but if you look at all these recent tragedies, the school shootings, the supermarket shootings, all this stuff, in almost every single case, there were red flags, right?
mhm,
And sometimes the people even went to the police, and depending on what state you're
yeah,
in, the police can legitimately say, well, really, no one's broken any law, so there's nothing we can do. But well, that's not the case in Connecticut, and it's not the case in I think it's up to 18 or 19 states that have a red flag law now. But it's I think common sense tells you that you should be able to do something when you get good evidence, real indications that someone is a danger to themselves or to others, and they have access to firearms. You should at least be able to separate them from the firearms and refer them to a mental health evaluation. Yeah, so obviously, I've been involved in this for a long time, and as is the case with almost any issue these days, there's people with very strident opinions on both ends of the spectrum, right? Um, I am I believe in incrementalism, step by step. I'm good with that. But I also believe that it's extremely important to listen to what your opponents are actually saying. Listen to their arguments. 'Cause sometimes they have a legitimate point, right? And I think in any public policy reform, if the people who just philosophically disagree with the reform, if they've got some valid criticisms, then it's perfectly okay to adjust your proposal to take into account whatever their criticisms happen to be. So, like, for example, with the red flag law, I mean, it's more than 20 years old now. We passed this in 1999. Connecticut was the first state to do it. And in the aftermath of a different tragedy, which I'm happy to describe, when we were debating it, some of the Second Amendment crowd, let's just refer to them as that, so this sounds like a turn in your neighbor law, and just because you don't like your it's like, well, okay, maybe it's certainly possible that that could happen. And so we made it very clear that the police would have to follow a very specific procedure. They would have to investigate the reports they get from whomever it is, a health provider, which it frequently turns out to be the doctors and mental health professionals that are calling the police for these red flag laws, or a family member, or sometimes a neighbor. You have to make sure that what they're reporting to you is actually the case. And then based on that, you have to write it down in an affidavit, just like you would with a search warrant or an arrest warrant. You have to get a judge to approve of it. And then the person is entitled to a hearing in a very, very short order where evidence has to be provided in court. So, I mean, these are all the due process protections that people were complaining about. And I'm happy to say that at the end of the process, quite a few, let's again, pro Second Amendment legislators voted for it because they felt that it accommodated their concerns. So I think it's very important to listen to what the critics are saying. The other thing I think it's important to acknowledge is that it is, in fact, in the United States Constitution. It's there. It says what it says in the Second Amendment. And on top of that, in Connecticut, in our state constitution, it says every citizen shall have the right to keep and bear arms in defense of themselves and the state. It doesn't even make a mention of a well regulated militia or anything like that. And so, in other words, it's in the Constitution, and we all take an oath to uphold what it says in the Constitution. And so I think you have to acknowledge that none of these things I'm describing involve prohibiting people from owning guns, right? You can put yourself in that category by getting convicted of a felony or something like that, but still, it's you have to acknowledge it, because I think there are people who tend to be bordering on sort of the paranoids, right? Who think this is all a big plot to confiscate everybody's guns, and it's not. So I think if you in your advocacy, if you acknowledge that, right, you say, look, I mean, responsible. I would never own a gun. I think the decision to own a gun is a very dangerous decision to make, right? You are really putting in jeopardy your life and those of your family members and friends just having a gun available. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to back that up. But some people want to do it. Okay, I got it. But just so you know, your ownership of that gun, you have that right to do it. But with that comes an extraordinary responsibility, just like driving a car or anything else like that. Like, and if something goes wrong, it's going to be your fault for not properly securing that firearm, etc., or carrying it around while you're drunk, for example, that type of thing. And the parents of the shooter in Michigan are learning that the hard way. I mean, it's just announced that they're both indicted for manslaughter because they permitted their kid to have that gun and they knew what a risk he was, right? And so, I mean, these are important lessons to have. It's like you can have a gun, but just so you know, there won't be any excuses if something goes wrong. And to limit the types of guns that are available, like in Connecticut in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, aside from adding more types of weapons to the banned assault weapon list, we also banned large capacity magazines. So if you can't sell magazines that hold more than 10 bullets anymore in Connecticut and things like that. And for example, now we've expanded the permit requirement to carry around a handgun. Now it applies to any gun. And you can't buy any gun privately or from a gun dealer in Connecticut without already having a permit. You can't buy ammunition in Connecticut without already having a permit. And that gives us the ability to sort of keep track of what's going on, but at the same time to do our best to make sure that people who are not responsible have a hard time getting their hands on guns. Now, of course, when you say that, people point out, well, what about all these gangbangers in the city shooting each other? Yeah, that's real, right? But a lot of the fatalities, a lot of the gun fatalities in the country have nothing to do with gangbangers. The number one category for firearm deaths is suicide. And so a lot of that are people that probably shouldn't be anywhere near a gun, but there they are. And a fair number of those are murder suicides, like the domestic stuff. So those are not gangbanger type scenarios. But the country's flooded with guns, and shouldn't be a surprise that we have all these side effects of that.
I was really ignorant and I never really thought about gun law and control until Sandy Hook. And then I started having conversations, which were not really conversations because it was so, fresh and so personal and so hurtful that I would just become so enraged and I couldn't, like you're saying, listen to what I couldn't do that. I couldn't listen. Now it's been 9 years. It's going on 9 years. I'm hoping this episode will drop on the 14th. I think it's time to look at it again, see what I can do and see what other people can do. Is there anything else you wanted to say about the legislation before we actually talk about the experience of the event?
One thing I want to say, and this is in the news at the moment too, right? And that is this whole issue of self-defense and firearms, right? The Ahmaud Arbery case down in Georgia and the Rittenhouse case in Wisconsin. I mean, I think here you're beginning to see people who, apart from, let's say, having weapons to defend themselves or to go hunting or something like that, are decided to take those weapons out and affirmatively put themselves in the middle of a situation and end up killing people and then claim self-defense. So the self-defense laws are very technical. I really don't want to go into those right now. We could if you want to, but my point is this is like another side effect of the current complicated politics in our country, and that is people deciding to bring guns to a political argument or use their own personal guns to enforce the laws as they see them to be in their own neighborhood, right? That kind of thing can easily get out of control. And I think what you're going to see, at least the discussion will begin about whether or not the self-defense laws in states and in the federal government need to be reconsidered in terms of could we add some language there that makes it clear that you can't claim self-defense if you go out of your way to inject yourself into a situation where you have no business being, right? We're not talking about a homeowner protecting their home. We're not talking about a business owner protecting his or her business. We're talking about people who decide it's their responsibility to put themselves in the middle of this. And leaving aside the whole issue of doing it to advance a political point of view, right? On January 6th, what we saw happen in Washington, D.C. was obviously horrific. But just imagine if DC didn't have the strict gun laws that they have, and just imagine if it wasn't made clear to everybody to just do not bring guns into the District of Columbia that day, right? Uh, Picture in your mind that scene at the Michigan State Capitol where protesters were inside the Capitol with these assault weapons, waving them around. I mean, just imagine if that was the scene in DC that day. Can you imagine how that would have gotten out of control? And how people would have gotten killed, certainly. I mean, these are things that now we really have to think about, and there's probably reasonable ways to come up with public policies through legislation that deal with those situations that were kind of unthinkable just 10 or 15 years ago.
How can we, I don't know if pressure is a word, but how can we lean into our politicians to do better in this area and to think about, change, like you said, changing the language?
So, unfortunately, almost all of these kinds of significant changes are the catalyst is some sort of tragic event, right? And so now we've got the Rittenhouse and the Ahmaud Arbery murder. I think the best way to get the conversation started is to ask policymakers like legislators, like, what is the law that governs under what circumstances can you intentionally go to a riot with an assault weapon? I mean, which is what Rittenhouse did. Or what is the law about if you see somebody suspicious in your neighborhood chasing after them with a shotgun? What is the law on that? And could you claim self-defense? For example, going back to the Sandy Hook situation, if if you were following that trial in Georgia, that was all about self-defense. And the guy McMichael, who was the one who pulled the trigger, his basic argument was that he confronts Ahmaud Arbery, and McMichael's got a shotgun, and Arbery's not threatening him, is trying to sort of back away, and McMichael keeps on coming, and Arbery grabs the barrel of his shotgun, and McMichael claims that that is what gave him a reasonable fear he's about to be killed, and that's why he shot him, right? So think about what happened at Sandy Hook, right? The shooter drives to the school, gets out of his car carrying an AR-15, walking towards the door. What if a teacher or someone had seen that and ran up to him and grabbed the barrel? Would that guy have been justified in shooting him and claiming self-defense? I mean, like, the police tell people if you're in an active shooter situation that you should hide, or run, hide, or fight in that order, right? And what does fight mean? Fight means you're supposed to, stop, grab the gun, or try and if you doing that gives someone the right to kill you. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that's what that's supposed to mean, but that's the argument that the defendant in Georgia was making, right? And so I think these are the kinds of things that have to be addressed in legislation. And I think by asking legislators, like, what is the law in this situation? What should the law be? And sometimes you have to give examples to people. So, like, one question that occurs to me, it's like, given all the circumstances of the moment, what happens when a police officer pulls over a car that's got a driver and a passenger? And let's say the cop is white, and let's say the driver and the passenger are African American. And let's say the cop decides to pull out his firearm. And let's say the cop is being very sort of provocative with his language, etc., with the gun out. If the passenger shoots the police officer and claims, I did it in self-defense because I thought the officer was about to kill my friend, which is the test for self-defense. If you reasonably believe that someone else is in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury, you are justified in using deadly force. What about that scenario? I mean, you could see how these things get carried away. What if, Rittenhouse shot one of the two, killed two people? He shot three, but he killed two. One of the two people he killed also had a gun, and that person had his gun out. And Rittenhouse claimed I shot him because he had his gun out. What if that guy shot Rittenhouse because Rittenhouse had a rifle and was waving it around? That guy would have been able to claim self-defense, right? So I mean, it's all of these things that were really unthinkable until recently, that now it's a reality that has to be addressed. And I think just saying to legislators, have you considered what the law should be in these types of situations? Sometimes that's the way to get the discussion going.
All right. It's good information. Do you want to talk about the event of Sandy Hook and emotionally and how it provoked, what it did to you and how maybe it changed the way that you looked at gun legislation?
Well, it didn't really change the way I looked at it, but so, I remember this day very clearly. Dan Malloy had gotten elected governor in 2010 in Connecticut, and he appointed me to be his criminal justice advisor when his term began in January of 2011. And so he had been in office a little over a year, or a year and a half, I guess, almost 2 years. And so we had a lot of criminal justice reforms on our plate at the time. And I remember texting back and forth with a good friend of mine who was the governor's counsel at the time when the news was breaking that some kind of shooting happened at this elementary school in Newtown. Obviously he was with the governor and him saying it's really bad. It's really, really bad.
Mm.
I spent the whole day in my office in Hartford, but the governor went down to Sandy Hook, and I think is well known. He is the one who had to break the news to the parents who were all assembled in this gymnasium or cafeteria, and in the governor's telling, he said that the state police who were in charge of the investigation at this point, and this was just unfolding, and it happened maybe 7 or 8 hours earlier, and now all these families were distraught and didn't really know what had actually happened to their children. The state police policy is like, we're not going to say anything to parents until we confirm the identities of the children who were killed. And the governor said, I can't, I mean, this agony is too much. They have to just know. So the governor took it upon himself to go in and inform the parents that, if you haven't been reunited with your child, then your child has died.
Mm-hmm.
And so Governor Malloy is sort of very, at least in a formal way, unemotional guy, right? And
Right.
I've heard him tell the story I just told you only a few times, but I mean, he, as I am right now, and I think anybody who thinks about this scene, it's hard to not get emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately, in my role, I'm the policy guy, and immediately it came to mind that that people are going to take different positions on this based on their
Yeah.
philosophical views on guns, etc. And so immediately, we tried to figure out, what exactly happened. Could it have been prevented? What, were there warning signs? How did the kid get the weapons? Things like that. And the governor made it very clear, as did the legislature. So this is December, right? And the legislature would normally not come into session until February. And it was pretty quick that people said, like, we have to respond to this legislative. We got to do something. And it was unusual. There seemed to be broad bipartisan consensus that we really did need to do something very comprehensive to address this. The legislature set up a sort of a select kind of committee to try and come up with a comprehensive proposal. The governor was consulting with a variety of experts, and I was involved in that discussion. It by the time we got, like, after about a month or so, it was clear that there was a lot of ideas on the table and that there was a willingness to do something very aggressive. And that's when the legislators started dragging their feet a little bit. And I think this came more from, I don't want to be partisan here, but it was, the Democrats, Governor Malloy was a Democrat, I'm a Democrat, the legislature was controlled by Democrats. But the Republicans, I mean, that's where you found the concentration of sort of pro Second Amendment people, for want of
Mm-hmm.
a better label. They started getting a lot of pushback from the gun manufacturers
Mm-hmm.
and from the NRA that, don't agree to these things. The original plan was to have a special session of the legislature in January to enact all this stuff, but that never happened because you couldn't quite get to the final finish line because the goal was to have it be bipartisan. And in early February, late February, there still wasn't consensus around what to do. And then I remember Governor Malloy said, okay, that's enough time. You got to do it. And he put out a list of things he should be in this because we had been working on stuff ourselves. And he kind of, I think it's fair to say, shamed the legislature into taking action, which they did. And the end result, in my experience, was the most ambitious, comprehensive set of gun reform proposals I've ever seen. And and they've been in effect now for almost 10 years. And I think the results speak for themselves. I mean, Connecticut has the fourth lowest gun fatality rate in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the other states that are like one, two, three, four, five, six with us are all in the Northeast. They all have similar laws. We've accomplished at least that much of the goal to get it to the point where it's very hard to get your hands on guns unless you can demonstrate that you're a responsible gun owner. Um, One of the big problems, of course, is that guns end up in Connecticut illegally because you can buy them in other states and just drive them here in the trunk of your car. It's all
Mm-hmm.
illegal, but I think if every state had laws similar to Connecticut's, there'd be a lot fewer people being shot and killed in this
Right.
country every year. And in Connecticut, if you're a law-abiding gun owner, you have every right to have as many guns as you want. And that system seems to work pretty well.
Well, that's good. That's reassuring, even though it does seem like after Sandy Hook, for me, I was really ultra aware of all the mass shootings that happened, and it seemed like there was practically a new one every week
Hmm.
in the country. So for me, just kind of going back to when I found out about what was going on, I was actually registering for school. I was in the last semester of my graduate degree, and I was actually registering, and the ladies behind the counter said, "Oh, there's been a shooting in Newtown." And like that got my attention right away.
Mm.
And I was a supervisor at the local coffee company, like I said. And for me, I just felt like I needed to be at the coffee shop. I don't know why, but I was like, okay, I need to register. I need to go. I had no idea what the damage was, what the situation was, but I did go to work and I put on my apron and started working. And, parents were gathering there. The news media, once it kind of came out what was going on, they were there. They were trying to get me to make statements. And it was just, it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. And I guess one of the things about it that I wanted to say is that we had people calling from other countries to basically pay for our community's coffees. So like if a community member came in, people from other countries were like laying down their credit card and saying put $100 on, because people were so torn up and so, moved by it.
Mm.
But I guess what happened then for me and what I realized, because I do travel out of the country, not lately, but I do. And we have such a horrible reputation because of the gun violence in our
Huh?
country. Some people will not come to our country just because of that, because they think they're going to come here and get shot, which they
Possible.
could.
Yeah.
It is possible. And so it really put us on, I guess we already were, but I think Sandy Hook was the thing that really put us on that international
Yeah.
radar. And it made me start realizing like what our perception as Americans, I mean, in a bigger picture, how we're perceived. And it's kind of, I'm embarrassed about it. I'm embarrassed of our international reputation when it comes to gun violence.
Yep.
So that's kind of been my bigger picture. And I really appreciate the work that you've done, especially now that I've kind of, done a deep dive into what you're doing and some of the different issues you've taken on, especially with gun legislation and the fact that, you were the red flag guy. I didn't know that. And, I don't know what else there is to say. I really haven't looked at this or talked about this in a long time. And like I said, I think it's time to kind of relook at it, assess where we are, and maybe you could tell us where, well, you kind of already did, how far we've come and if we've made progress. Do you think we've made progress as a country?
On this topic, as a country, not a whole lot, I think, because there are more and more guns in circulation every year. I don't know how many of these senseless shootings it's going to take before people are fed up. I mean, enough people to change the policies. It seems daunting, right? And the best, in my view, the best we can do is like in our area of the country, we can have sensible laws, and as a result, a lot fewer people are getting killed. But I don't know. I think the polarization in politics makes it almost impossible to do anything significant, really. Uh, you know, like the COVID situation being another example of this. It seems like any critical thinker realizes there's very sensible things to do that doesn't really affect people's rights. But for whatever reason, people are reluctant to do this stuff. And by the way, one thing I didn't mention is, like I said, I was in the legislature in the late '80s, early '90s, and we had a lot of hearings on different types of gun control bills. And I remember very clearly at the time thinking that what some of these folks are saying, some citizens that came to testify in these bills, some of the things people are saying is like they think that the Second Amendment was put in place so that citizens could deal with tyranny on their own. In other words, if they don't like something, they
Mm-hmm.
feel like they have the right under the Second Amendment to take guns and deal with it. And I remember thinking like that's like not a that's pretty unhealthy because I'm pretty sure that's why they put elections in the Constitution, right? That you
Mm-hmm.
may not agree all the time, but okay, we all have an opportunity to weigh in on this, and when the decision's made, the decision's made. And I that's my ultimate fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just like these random shootings, but it's just people. That's why I mentioned the January 6th situation. If you added a bunch of guns into that, you can only imagine how bad that would have gotten. So that's a real concern about people's views about owning guns. And the other thing we're finding, the police will tell you that in recent years, when they are investigating different types of situations, it's not unusual to find that a gun owner has like 10 or 100 guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition and all kinds of weaponry. I mean, so it's not the case like people have a shotgun and maybe a handgun for some, like they have countless guns in their homes. And it's like, what is the thought process that goes into this, right? And the manufacturers are marketing, you know, they're deliberately trying to sell people more and more guns, right? I mean, have a customer buy all these different types of guns, different colors, different models, different, you know, add-ons and stuff like that, and it's just like this is a little bit crazy, and
Yeah,
I just worry
it
we're
is a different mindset. It is a different mindset. And I was surprised that week after the shooting, I had a conversation with somebody who I respect who was in law enforcement who really gave me some backlash about, we need to do better with gun laws and all that kind of thing. And I just, it was the first time I really realized what you're talking about is it is a different mindset.
yeah.
And people are very stubborn about what they believe, and I am still shocked that we didn't immediately as a country, do something about this issue that we have with, so many guns and people going in and shooting up places. I was, in a way, I have to say, I feel, and this is probably why I don't talk about it very often, is because I feel hopeless about it. I feel hopeless that there's going to be any kind of real change.
Well, I mean, sooner or later it's going to happen. I can remember I had a lot of dialogues with the gun crowd in all these various debates, and I can remember saying to them, I said, "Look, your worst nightmare is that the Second Amendment gets repealed and all the guns get confiscated, right? Okay, I got that. I personally don't think
Yeah.
that's very likely, but apparently that's your worst nightmare. But all I can tell you for sure is that the more of these incidents that happen, the sooner that day is going to come. So it seems to me it's in your best interest to figure out a system which makes it less likely this stuff is going to
Right.
happen, right?
Yeah.
If you care about your guns, you don't want these mentally disturbed people shooting up schools and supermarkets and stuff like that, because each time this happens, the odds that your the things you feel like you're entitled to are going to be affected, right? And so it's like we all have to take responsibility here. And it's almost as though when you talk to these people, it's in the aftermath of one of these shootings, it's like, well, it's all about mental health and stuff like that. Okay, fair enough. What about a mandatory mental health examination in order to have a gun permit? What about
Yeah.
that? Like, no, we can't
Yeah.
say that. Well, then what are you saying, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what is it you're saying? It's about mental health.
Right.
It's frustrating, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
it
I'm
is.
an optimist, so I think it will get
Okay.
better over time. But where
Well,
does
I'm going to go back to what you said in the beginning of the interview, is that incrementally things change.
yeah,
And when I'm talking to you, I can think of some people who have changed. I can think of one particular individual that I know that got rid of all of their automatic weapons, which, what do you need that for?
right.
But somehow the event and my closeness to it and my passion about it helped them to realize, yeah, I don't need this, neither does anybody else. And so it's incremental. And I will try to keep landing back on that, what you said in the
Yep.
beginning, because I think that that does, that's how things are changed more incrementally. So thank you. I really have enjoyed talking to you and learning more about this. Was there anything that I didn't ask you or that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing, and I will be forever grateful that on that day in Sandy Hook, was not asked to go down to to Newtown
Hmm.
to be at that school. I know quite a few people, from the governor to the state police to prosecutors, who were there on that day, and I think the mental images they have will haunt them for the rest of their lives. So I'm very grateful I wasn't required to do that, right? And so um, I just feel bad for the people who are directly and indirectly involved in these things, because I, I can't even, especially from the parents to the teachers to the townspeople like yourself, it's just the idea that these things actually happen is just something that will torment
Yeah.
people for their entire lives.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. Um, I was, I had a long distance relationship with a guy from Madison, and he was coming to Newtown for Christmas to spend Christmas with me.
Hmm.
Of course, he had his tickets and everything, and then the shooting. And then when he got here, he said, we were in a grocery store, and I remember him saying, everybody looks like they're in shell shock,
Yeah.
like there was a bomb that went off.
Yep.
And he said, it's in everybody's face.
Hmm.
And it was, that I stepped back and looked at it, and it was like, yeah, this town and this community is changed forever.
And,
And
and
I, Yeah.
And I just want to
Go
say,
ahead.
like, I think it's even more so because, I mean, as you know, Newtown is a very upscale, upper middle class, lower upper class community, and it's almost all white. It's this I think people moved there because they felt that it was so totally safe. They could send their kids to good schools, and for this to happen there, I think people could say, well, then it could happen everywhere, anywhere. Yeah, it definitely could happen anywhere.
Yeah.
That's for sure. That's
Mm,
a fact, and that's all the more you cannot escape these things. I
right.
mean, the odds that they're going to actually happen to you are extremely low, but they do happen, and they can be prevented, and that's the key thing. So, in one respect, and I think that's why you got action got in the Connecticut legislature that year, because I think people felt vulnerable,
Yeah.
and so here we are.
Yeah. So where can people find you? What are you doing today?
Well, I've been teaching at the University of New Haven. I'm an associate professor of criminal justice. Been teaching there since 1995, and I'm no longer, I'm not in the legislature. I'm not working for the governor anymore, but I'm on the New Haven Board of Police Commissioners. We do the hiring and firing of cops and all the training and stuff. And the governor appointed me to the Police Officer Standards and Training Council for the state. So I'm involved in curriculum for police officers. And I only bring that up because this training that goes along with the red flag laws, for example, is so
Mm,
important. And I think police are much more aware today than they were 10 or 20 years ago what options are available to them. And I try and emphasize how important it is not only for people to reach out to the police and give them information, let the police investigate it, but the police have to know how to take advantage of the authority that they've got to deal with these situations, refer people to mental health evaluation and treatment, or separate them from their guns, stuff like that. And so things are getting. I can see on the front lines things are getting a little bit better, right?
mm-hmm.
And so I'm happy to have that ability to do those things even today in my old age, right?
In your old age.
Yeah. 65
Um,
later this month. I'm all excited.
oh my goodness, you don't look a day over 40.
Thank you.
So there's one more thing I'm going to ask you,
Mm.
and it has nothing to do with the subject we're talking about, but I'm wondering if maybe you'll come back in October and talk about same-sex union and the impact that you've had on it, that type of thing.
Yeah,
Because I
sure.
do, one of my favorite things to talk about is to talk about the LGBT history. I've had some amazing guests. I don't know if you've listened to my podcast at all, but I recently talked to a married couple who put out a book, and perhaps you've seen it. It's called Loving, A Pictorial History of Men in Love, 1859 to 1959. It's
No,
a beautiful book.
it's
It's
great. Yeah,
beautiful. It's these
I'll
two
read it.
guys that, yeah, these two guys that, they were a couple since the 80s. They've been together since then. They're still very romantic, which I absolutely love. But they started collecting these photographs. And somebody eventually recently told them this needs to be a book.
It's
And
great.
so what I try to do is I try to bring to light the hidden history, the erased histories, the things that I think are important. And so if I tap on your shoulder again, maybe you'll come back in
Yeah,
October for LGBT month.
yeah, sure. No problem. Love talking about it. Connecticut was a pace setter on that topic too. So I'm happy to talk about that whole process.
Yeah. Oh, good. Oh, goody. All right. Well, thank you again.
Sure.
I really, I learned a lot. Hopefully, I'll move forward armed with this information that you've given me and the hope, the incremental hope. I like that. And, hopefully we'll talk again. Thanks for being
Sure.
here.
Anytime. Okay.
There you have it. Mike Lawlor on the 9th anniversary of the Sandy Hook shooting, talking about gun legislation. Be sure to check out our episode notes to find out more about Mike and how you can make a difference. Today, I'd like to end the show with the names of the 26 innocent victims that lost their life tragically on December 14th, 2012. Charlotte Bacon, 6. Daniel Barden, 7. Rachel Davino, 29. Olivia Engel, 6. Josephine Gray, 7. Anna M. Marquez Green, 6. Dylan Hockley, 6. Dawn Hoshbrung, 47. Madeline F. Sue, 6. Catherine V. Hubbard, 6. Chase Kowalski, 7. Jesse Lewis, 6. James Mattioli, 6. Grace McDonald, 7. Anne Marie Murphy, 52. Emily Parker, 6. Jack Pinto, 6. Noah Posner, 6. Caroline Previty, 6. Jessica Rakos, 6. Aviel Richmond, 6. Lauren Rousseau, 30. Mary Sherlock, 56. Victoria Soto, 27. Benjamin Wheeler, 6. Allison N. Wyatt, 6.